I know what all these answer choices mean. I've studied my transition words, so it's easy for me to think of all of them. That said is but, hence is so, for example is for example, just means what it says, and likewise is and, or similarly, if you want to get a little bit more specific about it. But these are all of our four main categories of the words. So we have all the different pieces represented here. Now let's see what it says and go from there. If the formation of Earth's mantle had been purely a product of core differentiation, whereby heavier elements sink toward the core and lighter elements rise, the upper mantle would be depleted of heavy siderophile elements. Siderophiles are much more abundant in the mantle than predicted in that model, however. Ooh, I don't love that. I don't love that there's a but right before that blank. Extraterrestrial material containing siderophiles, likely from asteroid or comet impacts, almost certainly accreted to Earth following the core differentiation. So, oh my God, this feels like a science passage in a transition question. So already, though, just from a strategy and trap point of view, I'm very skeptical of choice A. I can tell what they're doing. They want me to see the however before that blank and be like, oh, it's a but, right? The whole thing is a but. But the but is really here. So remember, if a transition word like however appears at the end of a sentence, it's actually as if it were at the beginning. So I can throw a but right here if I want to maybe understand this better. If the formation of Earth's mantle had been purely a product of core differentiation, so heavier elements sinking and lighter elements rising, the upper mantle, higher, would be depleted of heavy siderophile elements. Okay, so if it were purely that, then yes, as they're saying, heavier elements would sink, and so the upper mantle, the higher thing, would be depleted, would be lacking the heavy stuff. So that all makes sense with what they're saying in that sentence. But siderophiles are much more abundant in the mantle than predicted in the model, right? So what they're saying then is that the mantle does have these heavy things for some reason. Extraterrestrial material containing siderophiles, likely from asteroid or comet impacts, almost certainly accreted to Earth following the core differentiation, meaning added to, right? So basically a comet comes and boom, now the comet is part of Earth, right? So that's kind of what they're doing. So it's not a but, right? Because it's explaining this problem, right? We would think the heavy stuff is going to be on the bottom, the light stuff is going to be on the top. But, right, the but that I wrote is saying that there's actually heavy stuff on top as well. And we got to explain that. What's the deal? So there's no other but. We've already done the but here. And so extraterrestrial material, something else kind of landing on the Earth and putting the heavy stuff on top, that's not a contrast. That's an explanation. So I don't like that. Explanation makes me think so, right? So the siderophiles, the heavy stuff, are more abundant on top than we would expect. So comets and asteroids almost certainly added the heavy stuff after the core differentiated, meaning after the separation was supposed to happen. So that feels right to me. The hence feels right. It's not an example because that last sentence would need to be an example of the second one. So is that the case? Let me just double check here. So siderophiles are much more abundant in the mantle than predicted. For example, extraterrestrial material containing siderophiles, likely from asteroid or comet, almost certainly accreted. So it's not providing an example of the abundance. It is providing an explanation for the abundance of the heavy stuff. If it said, for example, a comet impact in Arizona shows a high concentration of siderophiles that likely came from that comet, then that would be an example of, hey, look at all this heavy stuff in the upper mantle that isn't supposed to be there. But we're not getting a specific example. We are getting an explanation. So those are different things, right? Explanation and example, they're not synonyms. And likewise isn't right because it's not a similar situation. It is explaining that situation. It is not talking about two things. It's talking about the same thing. And the so makes sense, right? I'll try to do another dumb summary of the whole passage, right? So if our theory is correct, the upper mantle would be lacking the heavy stuff. But the heavy stuff is more abundant in the mantle than the model predicts. So contrary to what we would expect. So extraterrestrial material, likely from comets, probably got the heavy stuff to land on the surface of the Earth. Like that's basically what they're saying, right? Is we would expect there to be no heavy stuff, but there is heavy stuff. So it must have come from somewhere. That's basically the passage. But oh my God, that is a lot of work, right? That reminds me a lot more of a reading passage than a transition question. So that's odd, but I think, there's a reason this is a particularly hard one. I would note though that the words themselves, the answer choices are not hard. There's two ways you can usually go with these transition questions. You can give me an easy passage and transition words that most people won't know, and then it becomes about the words. That's usually actually how it goes. Or you can give me a very complicated passage, but simple words. And I will disagree with anyone who says these words are not simple. They are classic cases of each of the categories. If you haven't encountered that said and hence yet, okay, they might be a little bit more rare than however and thus or therefore, but they're still doing the same thing. And I talk about these in my lessons. These are things that it's totally within your power to learn. And they come up often enough that they are kind of high on our list of ones to memorize and to very quickly be able to dumb summarize when we see them. So you really don't want to be entering a question like this confused about the words, because the passage is confusing too. And we really need to understand the words to have any hope of decoding this passage. But yeah, this would be the kind of case that normally I don't really want these questions to take me more than a minute. But this one might. So this one might actually kind of put me over the what I would normally think of as good pacing for this section. But that is okay because these are rare, and it's okay. Be flexible. If you get a crazy hard one that takes a little bit more time, take the time. I'd rather you get something like this right on a test than worry about getting to that hard passage that might take even longer and still have all the longer answer choices and on top of sorting through the complicated passage. So we're still able to prioritize these things, even if they do throw us a little bit and take a little bit longer than usual.